Story 1. I need to get this written down before my hands disappear completely. The marks on my skin spread a little more every hour, and I see less of my face in the mirror every time I look. My friends think I came back from Hollow Hills Cemetery the same as before. They have no clue they've been talking to something wearing my skin. Everything went wrong at 11:15. According to the cheap clock behind Mickey's diner counter, the rain hit the windows hard, making the neon signs outside look like blurry halos. My friends and I were sitting in our usual booth, with the torn leather seats sticking to my legs. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, but it was better than going home to an empty house. My coffee was cold, and a plate of half-eaten fries sat between us, forgotten. Chris was talking the most, as usual, his big varsity jacket taking up too much space in the booth. He loved these late-night hangouts, sharing urban legends while eating food he never paid for. Chris asked, "Have you guys heard about the forgotten ritual?" The light above our booth flickered, making weird shadows on his face. "Not this again," Megan said. She pulled her sleeve over a fresh bruise on her arm, another present from her stepdad. Chris leaned closer. "No, listen, my cousin's friend went to Hollow Hills Cemetery last month. He didn't come back right." The jukebox in the corner skipped, playing the same 3 notes of an old country song over and over. "What do you mean, didn't come back right?" I asked. "Old man Peters found him wandering the cemetery at dawn," Chris said. The guy kept talking about empty coffins and funeral setups appearing out of nowhere. He said the chairs were filled with things wearing people suits. My stomach turned. "Things?" I asked. Megan said, "Faceless things. My sister told me about this. The ritual pulls people in at midnight. They find this creepy funeral and then..." "And then what?" I asked. "They become part of the audience," Chris said. "Every time someone new walks in, the chairs are filled with these faceless creatures in rotting funeral clothes. But there's always one empty chair, waiting for the next fool who doesn't heed the warnings." Thunder boomed outside. The diner's lights dimmed for a moment, and my reflection in the window looked strange. "You're making this up," I said. A drop of cold sweat ran down my back. Chris pulled out his phone. "Peters swears he's found fresh funeral setups out there. Look at these pictures. Empty coffins just sitting in the grass, surrounded by all these old wooden chairs." The photos on his phone showed blurry shapes in the dark, black flowers scattered on wet grass, something that might have been a coffin. "Those could be anything," I said, but my hands shook as I pushed his phone away. Chris said, "Prove us wrong then. Go out there tonight. Take some better pictures." The diner's ancient heating system groaned. Cold air leaked through the windows, and goosebumps rose on my arms. "I'll do it," I said. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. "Jacob, we were just messing around. Don't be stupid," Megan said. I stood up from the booth. "No, you want proof? I'll get it." The linoleum floor seemed to tilt under my feet. "Some stories should stay stories," Megan said. Chris reached for my arm. His face had lost its usual smirk. "Seriously, man, I was just talking nonsense. Don't go out there." I pulled away from him. "Text me the directions. I'll show you there's nothing in that cemetery except old graves and your wild stories." The bell above the diner door chimed as I walked outside. Rain soaked through my jacket immediately. The moon hung low and bloated in the sky, surrounded by clouds that looked like reaching hands. A dog howled somewhere in the distance. The sound echoed off empty streets and dark houses, mixing with the rain. I had no idea I'd just accepted an invitation to my own funeral. The rain pounded against my windshield as I drove down Miller Road. My phone's GPS kept losing signal, the screen flickering between Chris's texted directions and static. The streetlights ended at the town limits, leaving only my headlights to cut through the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter at each turn. The radio picked up nothing but white noise, a strange buzz that rose and fell like whispered voices. Even turning it off didn't help. The sound continued through my car's speakers, growing louder as I got closer to Hollow Hills. A rusted sign marked the turnoff to the cemetery. The metal had rusted into strange patterns, but the warning remained clear. No entry after dark. My headlights caught something moving behind the sign. A shadow darted into the trees, too quick to identify. "Just a deer," I said. My voice sounded high-pitched in the confined space of my car. The dirt road wound through dense woods. Branches scraped against my car's roof like fingernails on metal. Each curve revealed more warning signs, their messages getting stranger like, "Turn back. They are waiting, and the ritual must be fed." The clock on my dashboard read 11:45. The numbers flickered, sometimes showing different times. My phone died despite being fully charged at the diner. An old church appeared through the trees, its steeple crooked and windows dark. The stone walls had turned black with age and something else, strange symbols carved into every surface. My headlights swept across the entrance, lighting up a figure in the doorway. It wore what looked like a priest's collar, but its face. I blinked and the figure vanished. The church sat empty, though the doorway seemed darker than the surrounding night. "This is stupid," I said. My breath fogged the windshield in strange patterns. The cemetery gates rose ahead, wrought iron twisted into shapes that hurt my eyes. The main entrance stood open, hinges creaking in a wind I couldn't feel. My headlights caught rows of tombstones, their surfaces writhing with shadows. A group of crows were sitting on a nearby mausoleum, which is a big stone building for burying people. Their heads moved together to watch my car, but their bodies stayed completely still. One crow opened its beak, but no sound came out. The road ended at a circular parking area made of gravel. The crunching noise of the gravel under my tires was very loud in the eerie silence. I saw other tire tracks on the gravel, but they all went in and none came out. I took my flashlight from the glove compartment. The light beam looked weak against the darkness and barely reached the nearest headstones. The names and dates on the stones blurred together and sometimes changed when I looked at them again. My phone vibrated in my pocket. This was strange because it had died a few minutes ago. The screen showed a message from an unknown number. "Welcome to your funeral. Please be seated." The clock showed 11:55. From deeper in the cemetery, I heard the sound of chairs being moved and a coffin lid creaking open. My flashlight beam shook as it moved across the old headstones. My footsteps crunched on dead leaves, and the sound echoed longer than normal. The path ahead twisted between old oak trees, forming a tunnel that blocked out the little moonlight there was. A crow called from the darkness. The sound repeated from different directions until it surrounded me. The birds remained hidden, but I could feel their wings brushing against my face and neck. My flashlight only showed empty branches. The path opened into a circular clearing. I saw rows of wooden chairs arranged in a semicircle. The chairs were old and black with rot. Dead flowers covered the ground. Roses and lilies turned dark like dried blood. Their petals formed patterns that I recognized from the church walls. In the center of everything was the coffin. The wood shone like it was freshly polished, reflecting my flashlight beam. Brass handles lined its sides, each one carved with faces frozen in screams. The lid was slightly open, showing a thin line of darkness. "This isn't real," I said. My breath came out like frost in the air. A chair creaked behind me. I turned around, but the seats were still empty. Another creak came from the opposite side, then another. The sounds moved as if invisible people were sitting down. The temperature dropped. My breath made clouds in front of my face, forming shapes that looked like words. The flashlight flickered, and its beam got weaker. My feet moved toward the coffin against my will. Each step brought me closer to the thin gap between the lid and the base. A sweet, cloying smell came from inside, like funeral flowers mixed with decay. The lid moved on its own, opening wider. My flashlight beam caught something inside, and I stumbled back. My own face stared up at me, pale and peaceful as if in sleep. The body wore a black suit I'd never owned, with hands folded over its chest. "This is impossible," I said, my voice cracked. The thing in the coffin opened its eyes. Its head turned toward me with a motion too smooth to be natural. My own eyes stared back, but they were too dark, like holes leading somewhere else. Its lips pulled back in a smile that was too wide for a human face. Movement caught my eye. The empty chairs weren't empty anymore. Figures sat in each one, wearing old, moth-eaten funeral clothes from different times. Their heads turned together to watch me, but where their faces should have been, there was just smooth, blank skin stretched over skull-like features. "Welcome to your funeral," the thing with my face said. Its voice sounded exactly like mine. My flashlight died. The moon came out from behind the clouds, casting a sickly blue light on everything. The faceless audience leaned forward in their chairs. The copy of me sat up in the coffin, moving jerkily like a puppet. Its suit stayed perfectly pressed despite the motion. A drop of something dark rolled down its chin. "The ritual requires a trade," it said, "a fair exchange of flesh and memory." My legs wouldn't move. The faceless figures stood up from their chairs, their bodies twitching and bending. They formed a circle around me in the coffin, their blank faces showing hunger. "Your seat awaits," my double said. It pointed to the one empty chair in the circle. The faceless ones reached for me with long fingers. Their touch was icy cold through my clothes. They began to sing in voices that sounded like static and screaming together. The coffin lid opened wider, a rectangle of darkness against the night. My double's smile stretched until it split its face, revealing rows of teeth that looked like polished bone. "Time to take your place in the audience," it said. The faceless ones pulled me toward the coffin. Their grips tightened until I could feel my bones grinding against each other. The copy of me stood up, its movements becoming more natural with each passing second as mine grew stiffer. In the distance, a clock began to strike midnight. With each chime, another piece of my reflection faded in my double's eyes, replaced by something ancient and hungry. The ritual had begun. The faceless ones dragged me toward the coffin. Their fingers burned like ice through my clothes, leaving trails of numbness across my skin. My muscles wouldn't work as my body grew stiffer with each passing second. My double stepped out of the coffin with strange grace. Each movement became more fluid, more natural, more like mine. It straightened its black suit and ran its fingers through its hair just like I do. "The transition has already begun," my copy said. Its voice had changed, becoming warmer and more full of personality, while mine grew empty. The faceless audience swayed in a circle around us. Their blank faces twisted and moved as if something was under the skin. A low hum came from their throats, discordant notes that made my teeth ache. "Stop fighting," my double said. Blood dripped from the corner of its mouth. Each struggle only feeds the ritual. The moon cast strange shadows through the trees. My reflection in the coffin's polished surface grew fainter as my copy's image grew stronger. The numbness spread up my arms and into my chest. One of the faceless ones gave me a small book. It was bound in what looked like human skin. The pages were open, showing spidery text written in dried blood. "The chosen must surrender flesh and form. The audience must grow. The pattern must continue. Give in," my double said. Its smile revealed teeth filed to points. "The empty chair awaits." The faceless ones pulled me closer to the chair, their bodies bent, heads turning completely around to watch with their blank faces. The wood creaked under their grip, the surface moving with carved symbols. A crow landed on the back of the chair. Its eyes glowed red in the moonlight, and when it opened its beak, I saw human teeth inside. "Your seat has been prepared," the bird said in a voice that sounded like bones grinding together. My double walked around the circle, touching each faceless one on their smooth, blank features. Wherever it touched, the skin rippled, and faces began to form, all of them mine, from different ages and times. "Past versions," my double said. Each one thought they could resist. Each one became part of the pattern. The numbness reached my neck, and my voice sounded distorted when I spoke. "Why me?" My double's grin stretched too wide. "The ritual chooses those who will make the best audience, the ones who understand the perfect horror of watching others fall into the same trap." The faceless ones pushed me into the chair. The wood groaned under my weight as the carved symbols started to glow with a sickly green light. Roots burst from the ground, wrapping around my legs and arms. "The process has begun," my double said. It pulled out my phone, and checked the screen. "Your friends will be missing you soon. I should get back to the diner." The roots tightened, pulling me deeper into the chair. My skin started to ripple and stretch, turning blank and smooth like the others. Memories flashed behind my eyes, my life, my family, my identity, all being stripped away. My double straightened its tie and cleared its throat. It spoke in my voice. "Practicing. Sorry, guys. Nothing out there. Just old graves and stories." The faceless ones swayed faster, their humming getting louder. Each note took away another piece of my humanity. The book in my hand grew warm, its pages filling with my own story written in fresh blood. The last chime of midnight echoed through the cemetery. My double walked away. Its movements a perfect copy of mine. It would go back to my life, live in my skin, while I became part of the audience, the perfect witness to the horror. The ritual had claimed another observer for its eternal pattern. And somewhere in the distance, I could already hear the next victim approaching through the cemetery gates. The roots burrowed deeper into my flesh. Each tendril carved new patterns under my skin, rewriting me from the inside out. The chair creaked as it absorbed me into its ancient wood. My bones shifted and cracked, rearranging themselves into a new shape. My double paused at the edge of the clearing. Its footsteps crunched on dead flowers as it turned back to watch my transformation. The moonlight caught its face, my face, but the features had already begun to change. Its skin looked fresher, younger, The dark circles under its eyes faded while mine deepened into hollow pits. "The change will be complete by dawn," my copy said. A crow landed on its shoulder, its talons digging into the suit jacket. "Your friends won't notice the difference. They never do." The faceless audience pressed closer. Their blank features rippled with remembered agony. One reached out and pressed its palm against my cheek. Images flooded my mind, memories of other transformations, other victims, other nights in this clearing. "Let me show you what you'll become," the thing wearing my face said. The world twisted. Reality peeled back like old wallpaper, revealing the truth beneath. I watched my double return to the diner in my car. The scene played out like a movie. Chris looked up from his phone. "Find anything out there?" "Nothing but old graves," my copy said. It slid into the booth with perfect casualness. "You guys were just trying to scare me." Megan's eyes narrowed. Something in her recognized the oddness, but the thought slipped away before it could form. The vision shifted. Days passed in seconds. I watched my double take over my life, speak with my voice, smile with my face. But small things changed. Its movements grew more predatory. Its eyes gleamed with ancient hunger when no one looked directly at it. More victims came to the clearing. My copy guided them here with whispered stories and subtle manipulations. The audience grew. The pattern continued. Back in the clearing, my skin had begun to smooth over. My features melted like wax, leaving behind a blank canvas. The roots pulsed with each beat of my fading heart. "Your turn approaches," my double said. Its grin stretched wider than human bones should allow. "The next one comes tonight. A girl who heard stories of the cemetery. She'll need a proper audience." The faceless ones swayed in their eternal dance, their bodies bent and twisted with immortal patience. I tried to scream, but my mouth had already sealed over, leaving only smooth skin. My phone lay in the dead flowers where my copy had dropped it. The screen lit up with a text from Megan. "Something's wrong with the Jacob who came back." But her realization came too late. The roots claimed the last of my humanity. My bones settled into their new shape, an eternal witness trapped in this clearing. My body fused with the chair as my mind expanded to join the others. The crow spread its wings and screamed a human scream. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the cemetery in shades of blood. My double walked away wearing my life like a new suit, leaving me to wait in the audience. The book of skin and blood dropped from my numb fingers, its pages filled with my story, adding to the record of all who had come before. The ritual had claimed another observer, another piece of its growing pattern. In the distance, a car's headlights swept the cemetery gates. A new victim approached, drawn by whispered stories and midnight dares. The audience stirred in their chairs, blank faces turning toward the sound. The show was about to begin again. Time moved differently in the clearing. Each night felt like an eternity of waiting. Our chairs creaked together as new victims approached. The audience never tired, never aged, never looked away. We existed only to watch. A year passed in the world outside. My double lived my life with inhuman precision. It wore my skin and spoke with my voice. But small changes appeared. My friends drifted away one by one. Their instincts told them something was wrong, but their minds refused to understand. Megan lasted the longest. Her text messages to my old phone grew more desperate. "You've changed. This isn't you anymore. What happened in the cemetery?" The thing that wore my face deleted each message with a smile. Its fingers left frost on the phone screen. Our clearing attracted more victims. A teenage boy on a dare, a woman investigating local legends, a paranormal researcher with cameras and equipment. Each one found the funeral waiting. Each one joined our ranks. The transformations became more elaborate. The ritual learned from each victim and improved its methods. The roots dug deeper, and the pattern expanded. I memorized every detail of our prison. The chairs were arranged in a perfect circle, each one carved from wood older than human civilization. The symbols hidden in the grain shifted and changed each time I looked at them. Dead flowers covered the ground in patterns similar to the ones carved into our bones. My double returned on the anniversary of my transformation. Frost spread across the grass with each step it took into our clearing. Its movements had become more fluid and predatory. My old face had become a mask it wore with ease. "The pattern grows stronger," it said. Its voice echoed with the sounds of other stolen lives. "Each witness adds to our collection." The faceless audience turned as one to watch it pass. Our blank features rippled with shared memory. The thing wearing my skin touched each chair, leaving ice crystals behind. "Your contributions have been invaluable," my copy said. The horror in their eyes when they recognize a friend in the audience, exquisite. A new victim's car pulled into the cemetery. Headlights swept across ancient tombstones as tires crunched on gravel. The engine died with a final sputter. "Right on schedule," my double said. A crow landed on its shoulder, its beak filled with human teeth. "She's been asking questions about her missing brother, the paranormal researcher who joined you last month." The audience straightened in their chairs. Our bodies creaked and twisted as we prepared for the show. The ritual demanded perfect witnesses. My copy adjusted its tie and smiled. "I'll leave you to your duties. The pattern must be maintained." It walked away, frost melting in its footsteps. The crow spread its wings and screamed with my original voice, the last piece of humanity the ritual had stripped away. Footsteps approached through the cemetery. A flashlight beam bounced between headstones, drawing closer to our clearing. The coffin lid creaked open as roots stirred beneath the earth. The book of skin and blood appeared in my lap. Its pages turned by themselves, making space for a new story. The audience leaned forward in their chairs, blank faces eager for the next performance. A young woman stepped into our clearing. Her flashlight beam caught the funeral setup, the waiting coffin, and the circle of faceless watchers. Recognition dawned in her eyes as she stared at my chair. "Jacob," she asked, "is that you?" But I couldn't answer. None of us could. We only watched, eternal witnesses to the pattern's growing power. Our blank faces reflected her horror as the roots began to stir. The ritual had begun again. The audience settled in for another show. And somewhere in the darkness, the thing wearing my face smiled and began planning its next collection. Story 2. Recurring dreams have always fascinated me. I've experienced them many times, and they really interest me. There are different online communities dedicated to this topic, and many people share interesting stories. The ones that fascinate me the most are those who claim to dream the same or similar things. One such place that people, including myself, dream about is called the dreamscape halls. Before you read any further, you need to know about the risks. I don't fully understand why, but some evidence suggests that learning about this phenomenon can make you experience it yourself. If you know about the SCP Foundation and its stories, this is similar to what they call a cognito hazard, which means something that can spread just by knowing it exists. It's also like when you buy a car and suddenly notice that car everywhere. So, by reading about this, it might happen to you too. If you're still here, I hope you understand what you're agreeing to. Over the years, I've looked at many websites, subreddits, and personal blogs about dreams. The mention of the dreamscape halls is rare, but I've found several people who have reported dreaming about them. There aren't many common details, but some descriptions overlap and keep coming up. Most people describe the dreamscape halls as a huge, never-ending maze of hallways and rooms. These halls often look like a retro, early 20th century hotel with polished wooden floors, black and white photographs, and decor from Western Europe before World War I. These dreams are often incredibly vivid, and the dreamer is almost always in control of their actions. Some even say these dreams feel more real than reality. The dreamer usually feels a subtle fear throughout the dream. They describe feeling uneasy, nervous, and hesitant to act. Mike was the first person who ever told me about his experience, and he's one of the main reasons I became passionate about researching this topic. When we spoke, he said it had been a few years since he last dreamt of it, but he remembers it like it was yesterday. His first memory of the event was finding himself in an unfamiliar room. He wasn't lying down. He said one second he was in his own bed, and the next he was standing in this place with no idea how he got there. The room looked like an early 1900s hotel room. Shiny wooden floors were covered by several rugs with intricate patterns. The walls had many black and white photographs of men, women, and groups with serious expressions. Mike looked around the room and saw a window with thin curtains. He went to the window and opened the curtains, but something wasn't right. There was nothing outside the window, just a black void that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. Mike described it as looking like the whole building was underwater in an ocean of crude oil. He thought about opening the window but decided it wasn't a good idea. Instead, he went to the door, which had the number 709 above the peephole. Mike looked through the peephole and saw an empty hallway. After a few moments, he took a deep breath and opened the door. Outside, he found a hallway with auburn carpeting that stretched a long way in both directions. He said the hallway was at least a few 100 feet long. On his left, he saw another hallway about 100 feet away. The place was eerily silent, with none of the usual sounds you'd expect from a hotel like plumbing or people. Mike didn't know he was dreaming at this point. He believed he had somehow woken up in this strange place. He started walking left down the hall, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. He passed 2 other doors, marked 707 and 708. He paused and listened, but heard nothing from either room. He thought about knocking, but decided against it. He continued past several more doors with room numbers. In the distance, he started hearing a rhythmic ticking sound, like a clock. He reached the perpendicular hallway and looked down it. The hallway looked almost the same as the first one, but about 40 feet down, the architecture started to twist. Mike walked towards it, feeling more confused with each step. He described it as looking like someone had twisted the building like a corkscrew. When he got closer, he saw that even the pictures on the walls were twisted. The pictures showed people with elongated mouths and widened eyes. Something about it felt ominous, so he turned back. As he did, a door on his right suddenly opened. Mike froze, his heart racing. He heard and saw nothing inside. He eventually got the courage to approach and found a stairwell. He stepped inside and looked down. It seemed to go on forever. He looked up and saw the same. He compared it to when you stand between 2 mirrors and see infinite reflections. Suddenly, he heard a loud bang below, like someone slamming a door. He flinched and looked down, but saw nothing. He felt an overwhelming sense of impending doom and began running up the stairwell without thinking. After climbing a few floors, Mike found a door that looked different from the others. Instead of grey slate, it had an oak wood finish, making it look like it belonged in a cozy cabin. He felt drawn to it and grabbed the handle to open it. Inside, he found a family room that looked like it came from a quaint cottage. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and the walls were decorated with taxidermy animal heads and pelts. Mike closed the door behind him as he heard footsteps coming from below. He backed away slowly and heard something reach the door outside. The next thing Mike remembers is falling out of his bed in a panic. He looked around, his eyes struggling to adjust to the light. He felt confused, but soon realized that it had all been a dream. However, the vivid dream stayed with him for a long time. That was the first time I had heard about the dreamscape halls, but it wasn't the last. After Mike shared his experience on a public forum, others messaged him to share their similar experiences. I spoke with several of these people, and many of them had stories similar to Mike's. Most of them were unnerved by the experience and didn't know what to make of it. Finding others who had experienced the same phenomenon was both comforting and worrying for them. Another user named Valerie and I started talking a lot about the dreamscape halls. She had also dreamed of this strange place, and her story was just as fascinating. Valerie's first experience was similar to Mike's, but the setting was different. She found herself in an unfamiliar room that looked like a lab. There were porcelain drawers, cold metal countertops, and polished linoleum floors. Several oxygen cylinders were on one wall, along with other mechanical devices she later identified as IV stations. On the opposite wall were 4 stainless steel sinks with various beakers, measuring cups, and flasks. She didn't recognize the place and swore she had never seen it before. The room had no windows, but had 2 doors on the same wall at opposite ends of the room. She approached the door on the left and found it was a storage closet with cleaning supplies. The second door on the right opened into a hallway, and her confusion grew. Unlike the lab, the hallway had wooden floors with Persian rugs running down the center. The hall seemed to stretch for hundreds of feet in both directions. Valerie paused, feeling anxious. The area was eerily silent, but she gradually noticed a ticking sound in the distance. With no direction to go, she decided to walk down the hallway to the right. She saw other doors lining the hallway, but didn't feel comfortable knocking on them or calling out. Aside from her own footsteps and the distant ticking, the environment was unnervingly silent. There were Victorian portraits on the walls, like those used before the invention of the camera, where wealthy families would commission artists. She didn't recognize any of the people in the portraits, but noted that the eyes seemed to follow her. Soon she reached a 4-way intersection with paths branching in all directions. She felt like she was in some kind of hotel, but thought it was strange to build one in a grid formation. Both perpendicular halls also stretched for several hundred feet, adding to her confusion. Like Mike, she had no memory of how she got to this place, and her fear grew with each passing minute. One of the doors on the left was propped open, and she decided to approach it. As she got closer, she smelled a delicious scent coming from inside. She peeked in and found an empty room that looked like someone's apartment. The oven was on, and a batch of chocolate chip cookies was baking inside. Despite the furnished apartment, there was no one living there. The room was well maintained and tidy, but there were no signs of a resident. As she walked further in, she noticed an adjacent door slightly open on the far side. She felt drawn to it in an inexplicable way. A cold breeze seemed to come through the crack, sending a chill down her spine. When she reached it, she carefully opened the door. Inside, she saw rays of light beaming in from beyond. The room was bathed in a soft white glow from at least a dozen different holes around the room. She couldn't determine the source of the light, but all the beams focused on a single point in the center of the room. In the center was a twisted podium surrounded by polished linoleum floors and a group of upturned plastic chairs. The podium was a twisted hunk of some kind of glimmering metal with hundreds of Polaroid photographs embedded in it. Valerie looked over the photos but didn't find them very significant at the time. However, 3 images stuck in her mind. The first was a pair of large iron towers, with one of them burning and disintegrating. The second was an object in the sky that looked like burning debris, possibly a plane that had exploded mid-flight. The third was a balding man with a mustache bent over a workbench, scowling, with various tools in front of him. As Valerie was looking at the photos, she suddenly found herself waking up in her bed. Like Mike, she described it as being in the room one moment and then back in her bed the next. At the time, she didn't understand the significance of the dream, but as the years went on and the dreams happened again, she began to realize what was happening. Valerie explained that this dream happened around 1999, and it wasn't until 2001 that she made the first connection to the photos she had seen. As we all know, in September 2001, the World Trade Center in New York was attacked by hijacked airplanes. 2 planes crashed into the towers, causing them to erupt in flames and collapse. Valerie remembers being horrified as she watched the events unfold, but she also felt a strange sense of déjà vu. One of the images shown on the news was almost identical to the photograph she had seen in her dream. At first, she dismissed it as a coincidence, as most people would. The idea that she had some kind of premonition seemed too far-fetched to believe. But then it happened again. On February the 1st, 2003, the Columbia space shuttle re-entered Earth's atmosphere and suffered a catastrophic failure. The shuttle exploded, killing all 7 astronauts on board. The imagery of the flaming debris falling from the sky was haunting and matched perfectly with the photo Valerie had seen in the dreamscape halls. Seeing abstract images of burning towers or flaming debris in the sky might be explained as just random dreams or memories from a movie. Valerie assumed she had seen these things in a movie or something similar, but she remembered the third photograph of a man clearly. She couldn't identify him for a long time, but then, 2 years after the Columbia disaster, she got her answer in the worst way. In February 2005, a man named Dennis Rader was arrested. He was known as BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill. He was a serial killer responsible for the deaths of at least 10 people between 1974 and 1991. As soon as Valerie saw his pictures in the media, she knew her dream was more than just a dream. Valerie's accounts made me very curious about this subject, and I started investigating it myself. Over the years, I talked to many others who had similar experiences to Mike and Valerie. Eventually, a small, secret community formed around this mystery, and they called these dreams the dreamscape halls. People's accounts varied a lot. Some had the dreams only once, while others had them nearly every time they slept. Some saw things similar to what Valerie described with the photos, while others saw different, more worrying things. The general idea was that these dreams could offer visions of the future if they were understood correctly. One regular poster, John, once shared that he and his family decided to move after one of his dreams. He was an Englishman living in Japan and said he saw a photograph of a wave of water destroying a city. In the photo, he recognized debris that identified the area as the town he was living in. Some people might be too young to remember, but many thought the world would end in 2012 because of the Mayan calendar ending. John believed this theory and thought his dreams warned him of disaster, so he took the hint and moved. It's hard to say if he was right, but in 2011, Japan was hit by a tsunami that killed nearly 20,000 people. It could have been another coincidence, but by this point, these coincidences were adding up. The idea of dreams revealing the future might seem ridiculous to many, and I felt that way for a long time. I always tried to entertain seemingly crazy ideas while also being reasonably skeptical. To me, a smart person knows we can't explain everything in the universe right now. What we consider normal today might have been seen as magic a few generations ago. As we learn more about the world, more questions come up. You might think that learning about the future from dreams sounds like a good thing, right? For a while, I thought so too, even after hearing people's scary experiences with them. But it's important to understand that this is far from risk-free. People in the community often warned about hostile and terrifying beings they encountered in these dreams. One of the most mentioned was called the Hat Man. Some may have heard of this being because it's mentioned in other communities. People with sleep paralysis, schizophrenia, or those who abuse certain medications often claim to encounter this entity. The Dreamwalker community described it as a dark, humanoid figure made of shadows, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Most said they felt a near-paralyzing fear upon seeing it, but few mentioned it physically harming them. It seemed to simply stalk you through the halls, and most people woke up before it caught them. Another common entity was called the Void. It was a mobile, dark blob that shifted and slithered around, consuming everything in its path. Luckily, it moved slowly, but most community members agreed that you should never let it touch you. The Knight was another commonly mentioned figure, a medieval suit of armor that shambled through the halls, following dreamers only when they weren't looking. Several people said they'd see it in one place, then turn a corner and find it waiting for them in a different room. Some believe this is a guard of the dreamscape halls, seeking to vanquish trespassers. The idea of a medieval knight in a modern hotel seemed strange, but enough people mentioned it that there must be something to it. The red one is potentially the scariest. It's described as a crimson-colored humanoid with many curled horns sticking out of its body. Those who saw it said it was fast and agile, with a fierce hatred for anyone roaming the halls. There are other beings as well, but these were the most commonly mentioned. Sadly, many members of the Dreamwalker Forum passed away unexpectedly during my time observing. It was always the same. The person would go to bed one night and never wake up. No one knows for sure if it was related to the dreamscape halls, but the coincidences continued to pile up. For a while, I saw this whole thing as just a curiosity. I've always been fascinated by spooky and unexplained phenomena, and this fit right in. Honestly, I thought these accounts were just an interesting collaborative fiction project like SCP or The Backrooms, but then I experienced them myself. The first thing I remember is suddenly becoming conscious, standing in a room I didn't recognize. There was a freshly made bed behind me, with other normal furnishings you'd find in an old hotel room. Like the others, I had no memory of how I got there, and at the time, I had no recollection of the dreamscape halls. The thought just didn't occur to me, leaving me with a sense of dread for this unfamiliar place. It's hard to convey the unnerving feeling it gives you. It's like severe amnesia. If you'd asked me my name at that moment, I doubt I could have told you. The place was silent, without any of the usual sounds you'd expect in a hotel room. No hum of air conditioning or plumbing, just silence. Eventually, I made my way to the door and opened it to find a hallway beyond. In both directions, the halls extended further than I could see. There appeared to be no one else around, so after debating internally for a few moments, I turned left and began to walk. Along the corridors, I found photos and portraits of people and landscapes, but none that I recognized. Before long, I came to a branching path that split off in both directions. This struck me as odd, because building a hotel with 4 intersecting pathways didn't make sense to me. Things made less and less sense the further I traveled. I had this creepy feeling that something was following me, but every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing. After several minutes of walking, I came across a room that looked different from the others. The door had a unique trim around it that made it stand out. When I touched the handle, it felt unusually warm. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. Inside, I found a room filled with papers and manila folders scattered everywhere. There were 5 computer setups on desks around the room, with wires spread out like a spider web on the floor. The monitors all showed static, which didn't make much sense. It looked like a neglected den of some crazy hacker, but there was no one there. Beyond the main room was a bedroom that was very different. It was well kept, perfectly normal, and even looked like it had been recently cleaned. The bed was made, the dresser drawers were closed, and the ceiling fan was free of dust. The only strange thing was the mirror in the corner. The mirror was covered with weird, tendril-like structures that looked like wet roots of a tree. The mirror also had strange properties. When I stood in front of it, it reflected the room but not me. I could see my own body as usual, but somehow the mirror couldn't. Around the edge of the mirror were several Polaroid photos stuck into the rim. Most of them were damaged and unrecognizable. Some were burned. Others were water-damaged and crumpled, but one photo was untouched. The photo showed a young boy overlooking a cliff. It reminded me of the scene from The Lion King, where they stand on Pride Rock and look over the prairie. But in this photo, there were only flames and destruction below. There wasn't much detail I could make out, but it looked like a landscape ravaged by war. As I studied the photo, a sudden clunk made me jump back. Something out in the hallway had slammed violently into the building. I scrambled back to the door, and when I looked out, I felt my heart freeze in my chest. Down the corridor, I saw an entity standing motionless about 100 yards away. Its frame was twisted and bent, like the gnarled trunk of an ancient tree. The arms that protruded from its torso looked like they were fused with roots and branches. Its head was like a bowl-shaped hollow, like a tree's hollow turned into a crude form of life. As I stared, I saw tendrils similar to the roots emerge from its back. They moved like eels coming out of a deep ocean trench, slamming into the walls and piercing through them like drills. The thing started lumbering towards me, and even though I had no idea what it was, I knew I had to run. The halls became more twisted the further I went, breaking apart into sections that looked like islands floating on a dark, endless sea. I kept jumping and climbing as far as I could until I couldn't go any further. After turning another corner, I found myself facing a chasm. It was like the hallway just ended, and there was another section of the building on the other side, at least 50 feet away. I glanced down into the void of nothingness, but I also saw that the building extended upwards and downwards much farther than I could see. The entire structure was colossal in a way that's hard to appreciate unless you see it yourself. As the entity continued advancing behind me, I was sure this would be my end, but then I woke up. I suddenly found myself awake back in my own bed, breathing hard and with my heart racing. It took several minutes for my memories to come back, and I began to process the experience I had just gone through. A sense of calm eventually came over me, but it was overshadowed by a pervasive anxiety that crept over me like thousands of swarming ants. The experience was too profound to be a simple dream, and that thought stayed in my head. This was well into my discussions with others who had experienced the dreamscape halls, but it was the first time I'd seen them for myself. It also made me realize how this phenomenon spreads. In the following years, I continued having periodic dreams about the dreamscape halls. I found more photographs that seemed to hint at future events, as Valerie had said, and like John, I once used the dreams to avoid a potential catastrophe in my own life. I was supposed to go to work one day during a blizzard, but called in sick because of what I saw in my dreams. That day, there was a 16-car pileup on the highway, with 9 people losing their lives. I can't say for sure I would have been among them, but it happened on the same highway I used to take to work. Once again, the coincidences kept adding up. I've had at least a dozen instances of getting premonitions of future events, or at least that's how I interpret them. Unfortunately, it's difficult to understand their meaning until after the event has occurred. Since these are dreams, I don't have any solid proof. I don't expect people to believe me. I just wanted to share my account in case anyone else has experienced something similar. For those who might find the idea of dreams that tell the future enticing, I have a brief word of warning. Obviously, being able to predict the future can be very beneficial, but these dreams are not without risks. As mentioned, there have been several worrying accounts of people dying in their sleep, which may or may not be related to the dreamscape halls. But there's something else too. I swear something has latched onto me. Either that, or my mental health is deteriorating severely. I've seen it and felt its malicious presence. It's little more than a shadow that lurks at the edge of my vision. I catch glimpses of it sporadically, usually at night, and when I do, I know it's time to move on. For years now, I've been moving from place to place, staying on the road and never settling anywhere for too long. But I'm tired. I don't know how long I can keep this up, but I don't plan on giving in either. I just wanted to put this out there for anyone who may be interested, and maybe someone has experienced these dreams too. Just please be aware that for those who seek forbidden knowledge, there is always a price to pay, and some of us have had to find that out the hard way. Story 3. I moved to a neighborhood in a small town north of Denver about a year ago. I had just gone through a pretty bad divorce and needed a house that was small enough for me to afford, on a single salary, and far enough away from my ex's family that they wouldn't come around bothering me. The house itself was an 1,100 square foot little bungalow, and it was the last house on the block before it turned into a dead end. Beyond that was a small forested area, densely packed with trees but still not fully blocking the sounds and lights of the expressway. My neighbors were a mix of young families and retirees, and I had no issues with any of them. One afternoon, a couple of weeks after moving in, I was unpacking the last of my boxes and trying to figure out how to use my new steam cleaner when there was a knock on my door. Sweating and with a messy bun on top of my head, I opened the door to see my neighbor Sarah, smiling warmly and elegantly. She held 2 wine glasses in one hand and a bottle of white wine in the other. Sarah and I had hit it off the first day I moved in. She was sweet and funny. I welcomed her in, but we eventually settled into 2 folding chairs on the front porch, drinking wine and chatting about nothing important. Halfway through the bottle of wine, Sarah cleared her throat and crossed her legs, turning slightly more towards me. She smiled at me sympathetically, and it caught me off guard. Laughing softly and awkwardly, I asked her what she was thinking. "I'm really hoping someone's told you already, because if not, I have to tell you," and she trailed off, laughing uncomfortably and tucking her hair behind her ear. She stared at her hands for a moment. "What are you talking about?" An irrational thought that it had something to do with my ex entered my mind, and my heart began hammering in my chest as I tried to keep eye contact with Sarah. "Has anyone said anything to you about the knocking at night? Anyone from the HOA or another neighbor?" No, knocking," I stammered, feeling a little tipsy and turning slightly towards Sarah. "It wouldn't have started yet, but soon. People have been knocking on our doors late at night, every night." "Who?" She shrugged, looking at me with another sympathetic look. "I mean, are they doing anything bad?" "No," she said, holding the word on her lips for a few seconds and avoiding my eyes. "No, nothing like that. Well, I guess they're stories, like poems, riddles, confessions." "Sarah, what the hell?" I laughed, thinking she was joking with me. "People are just opening their doors late at night and listening to random people's stories. Okay, thanks for the heads up." "No, I know how it sounds, I really do. And if you don't believe it, okay. But I wanted to tell you because when you hear the knocking, probably tonight, you shouldn't ignore it. You have to answer and you have to listen, okay? You listen until they're done, no matter what they say." Sarah was serious. I could see she wasn't joking and she wasn't amused by what she was telling me. I began to consider that she might be experiencing a delusion or something, but it felt real to her. "Okay, Sarah, I'm sorry I laughed, and I hear you." She nodded and patted my knee softly, stood up, and said she was headed home. Wide-eyed in disbelief, I got up quickly and walked into my house as Sarah walked away towards her own, neither of us caring to pick up the empty wine bottle or glasses. I spent the rest of the evening stepping over boxes instead of moving them, snacking on various items straight out of grocery bags, and watching true crime documentaries on YouTube. Halfway through a Dharma body language analysis, I heard a soft knock on my front door, and my body filled with adrenaline. No way, no freaking way," I said aloud to nobody at all, hobbling over to the front door with my left foot asleep. I looked through the small window on the front door and saw a relatively small and normal-looking old woman peering back at me. She wore a lilac sweater and pearls around her neck. I opened the door, feeling both frustrated and curious. "Hello." "Hello, miss. Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm sure this seems a bit unusual, but it's time for our visit if you'll have me." I was about to have a heart attack. The lady herself was totally non-threatening, but the situation made me feel strange and shocked. Had I moved into a neighborhood of a cult? Maybe it was a weird tradition, but Sarah hadn't spoken about it in a loving, slightly embarrassed way you might expect someone to talk about their weird hometown traditions. She was somber. "I'm not dressed, but I can listen from here." The lady nodded politely and began. "I've written you a poem." She looked up at me quickly with a proud, girlish smile. She reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a small, folded paper. I nodded, trying to hide my anxiety and impatience. "A small undertaking grows greater when idleness feeds the weight of later. Each moment passes, a silent loss. Stealing time, what is the cost?" The woman peered past me into my living room, her gaze landing on a stack of boxes next to my coffee table, covered in grocery bags and open snack containers. "Sorry, just moved in," I said, smiling. 5 days ago, dear." "Are you finished?" I asked, no longer hiding my irritation. She nodded, her eyes meeting mine with what seemed like authority. I closed and locked the door, turning towards my living room and feeling the hot sting of anger and insecurity rise up my spine. I wasn't offended by the old lady's judgment, but it triggered something in me. Nolan used to walk in the front door, scan the house, and criticize me for every unfinished chore. "Lousy bitch," Sad excuse for a woman. The mantra, "he can't hurt you anymore," didn't do much for the deep-seated belief that those things were true. It didn't matter if he wasn't here to think these things about me. I believed them now. I fell asleep the same way I spent the day, on my couch surrounded by snacks and boxes, with YouTube's algorithm giving me a mix of educational and disturbing videos. I wasn't a procrastinator. I was probably just going through the normal ups and downs that come with moving. But I was very good at self-sabotage. If Nolan and that nosy old lady thought I was too messy and taking too long to unpack, I would be the messiest person they'd ever seen. I'd live out of these boxes forever. The next morning, I moved through the house with spite, no longer stepping over boxes but pushing them out of the way with my feet. I think I'll spend time in the garden today. So I spent the entire day doing yard work. I pulled weeds and swept away the gritty powder of leaves that had fallen on my driveway. I thought about watering the grass to make the lawn more even, especially a large, much greener patch near the back gate, but it was getting too cold, and it might all change by spring. I worked all day because I wasn't going to unpack the boxes, and I didn't want to think about the next nighttime visitor. One knock, one poem from a frail old woman, and I was officially spiraling. I was fighting the irrational thought that these visitors had something to do with Nolan. I knew it couldn't be, and I pulled that belief out of my mind with every weed I yanked until my arms ached and sweat stung my eyes. Weird West Coast hazing bullshit. I finally went inside to shower and eat. I opened a fifth of whiskey I'd gotten as a moving-in gift, drank half of it, and crashed on the couch, boxes untouched. Dharma's droning Midwest accent playing over the silence, and a container of spinach dip starting to smell sour. But the yard looked fantastic, and the rest of the lawn would catch up to that beautiful emerald green patch someday. Around 1 a.m. there was a knock on my door. Expected, but still startling. I got up slowly, the liquor sloshing in my stomach. I had drunk it so quickly that it didn't even have a chance to disperse. Again, I looked through the window first, squinting against the front porch light. The damn wine glasses and bottle are still there. Standing on my porch, slightly more intimidating than the nosy old lady, was a young man who looked about 25. He was fit and tall, with his hands clasped behind his back like a business grad at a job fair. As I opened the door, he moved a few strands of his dark hair away from his eyes and gave me a friendly smile. "Ma'am," he said in a lilted voice. Being half drunk, half sick, and half asleep, I skipped the pleasantries and gestured for him to share his story. He unfolded a perfectly neat piece of paper, looking a bit embarrassed and eager. I almost kind of liked him. "A riddle, it's a riddle," he said, looking up at me and back down at the paper a couple of times. "I offer you escape when you feel pain. I leave you empty, but you come back again. What am I?" I squinted at him, unsure of how to read him and unsure if he was reading me. "Jameson, apparently," I said. I don't remember the moment his smile went from nervous and friendly to full-blown contempt, but I felt it in my chest. "It smells like that's the case," he said, his voice flat and disgusted. I slammed and locked the door, cursing the man and stomping back to my place on the couch. But I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with flashbacks of drunken fights and broken bottles. A sinking feeling of shame pulled me down and made my nausea worse. How many sick days did you use for no reason other than being hungover? That was when I first left Nolan. I was just trying to survive. I drowned my thoughts with the rest of the whiskey. The next afternoon, I woke up with a pounding headache and extreme agitation. The ice machine's sound was like an ice pick in my temple, and the heat was up too high. I'd had enough of my own mess and pulled myself off the couch, opened every window, and clung desperately to Tylenol and Gatorade as I finally unpacked every box and cleaned the house. I was sick and sluggish. My insecurities were burning on the surface of my skin, and my anxiety was screaming in my mind, but I pushed through and made the house look a little more like home. I traded the true crime videos for the much more wholesome Bob's Burgers and repeated the mantras my old therapist had given me. I am enough as I am. Their words are a reflection of them, not me. I took a break to make a cup of tea and stared out the kitchen window into my backyard. A growing sense of pride filled my heart as the house became as beautiful as its outdoor counterpart. I cocked my head, noticing the lawn again. How is that patch even greener now? Why is the rest browning so fast? It's no more than 40 degrees. I trust that everything will fall into place in time. Midnight came quickly, and I tucked myself into my little bed on the couch, stretching my legs out and embracing comfort and rest. I felt more at peace with myself and my home. Just as I began to nod off, I heard the inevitable knock on my front door. The whole thing was getting old, but I wasn't going to let it upset me again. I set an intention to treat whoever the visitor would be with kindness. I didn't understand or agree with this ritual, but I lived here now. I wouldn't take it personally, and I would respectfully listen and go back to sleep. I opened the door gently, peering at my visitor with curiosity. Black hair, blue eyes, collared shirt. My heart pounded in my chest, and a sickening, familiar sense of floating took over my body. It felt like a mix of vertigo and the seventh layer of hell. I knew it wasn't actually Nolan, but he looked a lot like him, and PTSD is a powerful thing. My mouth went dry, and I held onto the doorframe tightly. I nodded with everything I had left in me, urging the man to tell his story. "Hi. I know it's extra late, I'm sorry. This whole thing is a little silly, right?" he said, sensing my discomfort and smiling sympathetically. "It's okay. Want to come sit here on the porch? You seem very tired." He gestured gently towards the chairs and the table that still held the wine bottle and glasses. "I'm sorry, I forgot again." No, it's fine. I can stand here," I said. "Great. Okay. I have a confession, but that feels a bit heavy, so I'm going to make it into a game. Cool?" He seemed perfectly kind, but I felt half dead in my body and wasn't interested in playing along. I nodded nonetheless. "Okay, I start with a sentence or two and you finish it." I pressed into the four corners of my feet like my yoga teacher had taught me. "Okay. When I feel overwhelmed, I like to cry." He chuckled warmly. "Okay, nice one. Okay, it's only fair for abusers to be held accountable." "Right. Can't argue with that. You're doing great, even at the expense of..." A cringe-inducing ringing in my ears nearly put me on the floor. "What is this?" Can you just tell me your thing? I'm not feeling well. Please." "Okay, no worries. That's a tough one. Last one, and it's just like a little poem, okay? You'll like it." Slow, deep breaths. I did the best I could with what I had. His transgressions running around in my head. I'm a mangled mess of the words he said. Tear-stained cheeks and eyes stained red. He can't be stopped, so he has to be. I gathered every bit of strength I had to slam the front door shut, but the man blocked it with both hands, pushing firmly and gritting his teeth. He has to be, he shrieked, eyes bulging as his two hands counted the force of my entire body on the door. Finish it, damn it, and be done with it. You need to let this go." "Dead!" I screamed, my voice breaking and threatening to tear my throat. "Dead. He had to be dead. He couldn't be stopped, so he had to be dead. It was him or me, you don't understand." I sobbed and slid down the door to the cold ground, curling my body into a ball. I don't know when the man left. I don't know how long I lay on the wood floor with the front door wide open, and I don't know how long it'll be until they take me away. I'm staring out my kitchen window, smoking a cigarette. I don't remember where the greener patch of grass was. It's all covered in snow. Story 4. His name was Hanratty, and we worked together at Bud's Spuds. The first time I saw him, I thought, Christ, now they're hiring the undead. He had a long back hunched over at the neck like a shepherd's crook. His nose was hooked, his chin weak, his teeth bucked. But what stood out most about Hanratty were the two big black patches under his eyes. Anyway, the first few weeks I stayed low-key like the parole officer told me. No complaining, no squabbling, no pushing pills on a new client base. At Bud's Spuds, we had one job and one job only: trimming. The machine, which I called Tate, coughed out partially cooked and oiled potatoes, and us saps on the conveyor belt had to remove any black bits. It was like whack-a-mole, and occasionally partially cooked rodents came down the line. One night, Hanratty just collapsed, folding like a cheap deck chair, and our boss Dixon came down to the factory floor. "You been drinking?" "Hanratty?" Hanratty peered at him like he was a hallucination. Dixon was even stranger to look at than Hanratty. He was round like a potato. In fact, a real good one, what the boys called a Bobby Dazzler. He wore a wig, and on his wig, a hairnet that shifted and moved like flotsam. "No, sir," Hanratty replied. "You been taking zippers?" Dixon probably heard that on the local news. "No, sir. You're on my factory floor like a goddamn ghoul." "Insomnia, sir." Dixon stroked his chin. "Insomnia, huh? You should try jerking off before bed. Always worked for me." "Thanks, sir." The night shift at Bud's Spuds finished at 4 a.m, and in the changing rooms, I saw a medical opportunity. "You know the good stuff isn't zippers." "I don't want drugs," Hanratty answered. Whoa. Keep your voice down. I mean a beer, I didn't, but it was too late now. You got time for a drink? Time is what I always have. We walked a few blocks from the factory past other creatures of the night, lit by neon billboards screaming. We fit right in, the zombie and the convict. The whores did not approach us, nor the bums, because we were of the same station. We found some dive place called Last Chance Saloon, and I thought, well, that's just perfect. Bruce played on the jukebox Glory Days, and two old pool hustlers knocked around the balls, their cigarette ends spilling ash around their feet. The bartender was an old black dude the size of a 1950s fridge. 2 beers, I said. 2 beers and 2 whiskey chasers. No, 2 beers. And I said 2 beers and 2 whiskey chasers. One thing I've learned is you don't haggle with night walkers. Sure, buddy. The beer was as flat as my white ass, and the whiskey poured in 2 murky shot glasses. So what is it, Hanratty? Why can't you sleep? Hanratty shrugged. The guy moved in slow motion. He probably had the resting heart rate of a tortoise. Come on now. Men in bars at 4 a.m. don't keep secrets. Never been able to, he replied. My mum was a mean lady. There was something backward about Hanratty, and it made sense. Sleep was for recovery, and if you hadn't slept your whole life, the wound kept reopening, festering, destroying the healthy tissues around it. All our mums were mean ladies, I answered. Real mean. Religious mean. When I was a little boy, she told me dreams is where the devil hangs out. Yeah, Hanratty, your mum sure was a mean old lady. We watched the pool hustlers for a while, and then the owner piped up. Drink up, fellas. What the hell do you mean? He smiled, gold tooth gleaming. Even Last Chance Saloon has a closing time. So me and Hanratty continued walking the streets with no obvious direction in mind. The sun wasn't up, but it was threatening, and I wondered if Hanratty would turn to ash when it did. The land of the living was starting to wake up. A jogger came by us. A stack of newspapers was thrown into a newsagent doorway. An old Chinese lady went by carrying a box of loquats. The early bird catches the worm, I said. I never much liked worms. We walked maybe another block when we came to a store. At first I thought he was a waxwork. The guy was sitting right there in the window, a fella of uncertain ethnicity, uncertain humanness too. He sat in a rocking chair wearing a dark blue suit emblazoned with stars and crescent moons. Beside him was a nightlight, and about the comfiest looking bed I ever saw. He motioned both of us inside. Well, fuck it, I thought. We're on a journey to the end of the night as it is. When I pushed open the door, a bell tinkled lightly, and a dream catcher swayed above our heads. The room looked like a rich kid's nursery, a place where your mum wouldn't thrash you for wetting the bed or tell you Satan dwelt in dreams. The rocking chair was empty, yet still rocking, and then the guy appeared. Gentlemen. I jumped and almost headbutted the guy. Problem sleeping, he continued. He was a roly-poly sort of guy, shaped a little like Dixon but pudgier, something like a giant baby. He had an English accent, with a hint of hysteria in his voice like a Broadway performer. What kind of store is open at this time? I said. Well, what do you think? A store for people who can't sleep. Glancing around, I saw the sign Dream Cash Inc. and then his name tag, Mr. Melatonin. A store for people who can't sleep? What kind of nonsense is that? Well, there are stores for people who want to stay awake. There are? Yes, Mr. Melatonin's moon face swelled. We call them cafes, and there are stores for people who want to forget. Bars, and stores for people who are hungry. We call them... I get it, I said, cutting him off. But what pills are you pushing to get people to sleep? Tablets? No, never. Natural nocturnalism. I looked back as if to say, well, screw you, buddy. Maybe I sensed competition. A lot of people who buy narcotics do it because they can't sleep. Think narcolepsy. What is it you do? Hanratty said. A simple procedure. Our technical team inserts a chip into your brain. Voila, an 8-hour visit from Somnus. I laughed. A chip in my brain? Yes, Mr. Melatonin replied. His eyes were too wide open. And how much is it? Hanratty asked. It's free, of course. Free? Jesus Christ. Hanratty, you can't be serious. He's saying he'll cut open your skull and stick a chip in for free. Hanratty turned to me with an expression of someone much older, which I guess he was, at least in hours spent awake. The fine print, I said. Tell me the catch. No catch. You think you've found yourself a zombie and a dummy, don't you? So how is it free? Mr. Melatonin raised a finger. We include a 15-second advertisement before you enter REM sleep, like a trailer before the movie of your dreams. My lanky colleague was strangely captivated by this fairy tale character. Hanratty? No. What? He replied. Do I have to lose? Hanratty took some holiday days, and when he returned to Bud's Spuds, I was in for quite a shock. Hanratty, you handsome devil, I called out. Well, that was a slight exaggeration, but he didn't look half bad. Some of the stoop had left his hunched spine, he wasn't so pale, and the dark circles under his eyes had faded. What's more, he'd asked Dixon for a transfer to the day shift, a return to the land of the living. I suggested Hanratty come for a beer at Last Chance Saloon. He said his drinking days were over, but he'd take me to a restaurant after work. Painless, he reiterated, completely painless. Under the 4 a.m. halogen lights of McDonald's, it didn't look so painless. There was a 3-inch gash like a mohawk atop his head. Painless? He took a handful of fries and shoveled them into his mouth. I mean, a little annoying when I'm washing my hair, but it ain't like I'm short of hair nets. Hanratty started on his Big Mac, taking the bun off and stacking it with McNuggets. And I tell you, I sleep like a baby. 8 hours, 10 hours, sometimes 12, just for the fun of it. No side effects. He paused, slurping his XL Coke. No, not one. I'm a new man. I continued working the night shift and made a nice little side hustle pushing amphetamines on my fellow exhausted spud trimmers. And then one night I saw official-looking guys in Dixon's office. It took everything in me not to flee as the men in black came down past Tate spitting out spuds. These men want to talk to you. They're from the FBI, Dixon said. The FBI? Was this it? Was I going down on felony charges? I reached deep into myself for untapped wells of bullshit. What can I help you gentlemen with? You are friends with a Mr. Edward Hanratty. Hanratty! This was about Hanratty. I am, I said. We need you to come with us. I glanced at Dixon. That guy would stiff me for the pay. I'm afraid I can't. Sirs, as you can see, I'm doing important work. The potatoes continued flying by. The FBI guys looked cross. Dixon was momentarily panicked. He probably hadn't paid his taxes since Bush won. No. Take as long as you need. Here at Bud's Spuds, we value our employees. I told the feds everything I knew, and it turned out I was their star witness. Some shady stuff had gone down with Hanratty. Who'd have thought it? A backstreet 4 a.m. sleep parlor offering brain surgery. Before the trial, I was allowed to go see him in the neuro ward. When I arrived, his mum, Mrs. Hanratty, was there along with a doctor. Hanratty was the spitting image of the old lady, the build of a hat stand, the skull of a bird of prey, yet she looked meaner with it. He's dead, she said, fingering a crucifix that hung outside a frowsy blouse. Your son is in a coma, the doctor answered. That's just like Edward to get himself into a coma. What happened? I asked. The doctor looked down at his notes. Well, this procedure at Dreamcash Inc., this chip, has catastrophically malfunctioned. I looked down at Hanratty, long and rail-thin on the bed. His hooded eyes twitched. But he ain't brain dead. I mean, he's not a potato, is he? Just like my Edward to turn himself into a vegetable, Mrs. Hanratty intoned. Our technical team inserts a chip into your brain. Voila, an 8-hour visit from Somnus. I laughed. A chip in my brain? Yes, Mr. Melatonin replied. His eyes were too wide open. And how much is it? Hanratty asked. It's free, of course. Free? Jesus Christ. Hanratty, you can't be serious. He's saying he'll cut open your skull and stick a chip in for free. Hanratty turned to me with an expression of someone much older, which I guess he was, at least in hours spent awake. The fine print, I said. Tell me the catch. No catch. You think you've found yourself a zombie and a dummy, don't you? So how is it free? Mr. Melatonin raised a finger. We include a 15-second advertisement before you enter REM sleep, like a trailer before the movie of your dreams. My lanky colleague was strangely captivated by this fairy tale character. Hanratty, no? What? He replied. Do I have to lose? Hanratty took some holiday days, and when he returned to Bud's Spuds, I was in for quite a shock. Hanratty, you handsome devil, I called out. Well, that was a slight exaggeration, but he didn't look half bad. Some of the stoop had left his hunched spine. He wasn't so pale, and the dark circles under his eyes had faded. What's more, he'd asked Dixon for a transfer to the day shift, a return to the land of the living. I suggested Hanratty come for a beer at Last Chance Saloon. He said his drinking days were over, but he'd take me to a restaurant after work. Painless, he reiterated, completely painless. Under the 4 a.m. halogen lights of McDonald's, it didn't look so painless. There was a 3-inch gash like a mohawk atop his head. Painless? He took a handful of fries and shoveled them into his mouth. I mean, a little annoying when I'm washing my hair, but it ain't like I'm short of hair nets. Hanratty started on his Big Mac, taking the bun off and stacking it with McNuggets. And I tell you, I sleep like a baby. 8 hours, 10 hours, sometimes 12, just for the fun of it. No side effects. He paused, slurping his XL Coke. No, not one. I'm a new man. I continued working the night shift and made a nice little side hustle pushing amphetamines on my fellow exhausted spud trimmers. And then one night I saw official-looking guys in Dixon's office. It took everything in me not to flee as the men in black came down past Tate, spitting out spuds. These men want to talk to you. They're from the FBI, Dixon said. The FBI. Was this it? Was I going down on felony charges? I reached deep into myself for untapped wells of bullshit. What can I help you gentlemen with? You are friends with a Mr. Edward Hanratty. Hanratty! This was about Hanratty. I am, I said. We need you to come with us. I glanced at Dixon. That guy would stiff me for the pay. I'm afraid I can't. Sirs, as you can see, I'm doing important work. The potatoes continued flying by. The FBI guys looked cross. Dixon was momentarily panicked. He probably hadn't paid his taxes since Bush won. No, take as long as you need. Here at Bud's Spuds, we value our employees. I told the feds everything I knew, and it turned out I was their star witness. Some shady stuff had gone down with Hanratty. Who'd have thought it? A backstreet 4 a.m. sleep parlor offering brain surgery. Before the trial, I was allowed to go see him in the neuro ward. When I arrived, his mum, Mrs. Hanratty, was there along with a doctor. Hanratty was the spitting image of the old lady, the build of a hat stand, the skull of a bird of prey, yet she looked meaner with it. He's dead, she said, fingering a crucifix that hung outside a frowsy blouse. Your son is in a coma, the doctor answered. That's just like Edward to get himself into a coma. What happened? I asked. The doctor looked down at his notes. Well, this procedure at Dreamcash Inc., this chip, has catastrophically malfunctioned. I looked down at Hanratty, long and rail-thin on the bed. His hooded eyes twitched. But he ain't brain dead. I mean, he's not a potato, is he? Just like my Edward to turn himself into a vegetable, Mrs. Hanratty intoned. I'm trying to think how to explain this. We've had to invent a new term, a permanent purgatorial state. Well, that might as well have been in the Mandarin the surgeon who'd performed his operation spoke. The chip they implanted was programmed to play a 15-second advertisement straight into his mind's eye. It shows a family sitting down to enjoy a meal at McDonald's. And? Well, like I say, it malfunctioned. It plays on repeat the same 15 seconds. He's trapped on the edge of sleep, watching it over and over and over. Jesus of Christ, well, can't you wake him up? We've tried everything. Well, can't you put him to sleep? A flicker went through the doctor's eye that seemed to say permanent sleep would be a mercy, but state authorities would hold the Reaper off. He is stuck, the doc continued. I leaned in. His lips were mouthing something faint but repeating. It took me a while, but I got the pattern. Ba-da-ba-ba, I'm loving it. The doctor took his torch and shone it into Hanratty's peepers. I expected a kind of blank stare, but his pupils were fixed into narrow pinpricks of horror. It wasn't like at the movies when you can cover your eyes when Jason catches up, or in a dream when your 4th grade math teacher throws abacus balls at you and you pinch your skin to wake up. I'd only ever seen that look in people tripping on magic mushrooms, in those trips that turned nasty and sent a fair amount of guys out of their minds. But even with shrooms there was an endpoint. That fucker was in it for eternity, and he certainly wasn't loving it any more than a man chained up in a Chinese dungeon is as the next water droplet hits his forehead. Just like my Edward, his religious nutcake of a mum continued to get himself stuck. We fell silent, and the machines around him bleeped, and his lips moved, repeating the jingle. Again and again and again.